All right. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Reading League Florida's second monthly webinar. A quick word about our organization. The Reading League Florida is an affiliate chapter of the national not-for-profit organization, the Reading League. Our mission is to advance the awareness, the understanding, and the use of evidence-based reading instruction across Florida by providing, and across the country and the world, it seems, by providing professional development and other resources to teachers and stakeholders around the state. So our group of volunteer leaders is comprised of teachers and parents and university faculty, physicians and private clinicians and others who are dedicated to aligning Florida's reading instruction with evidence-based practices that yield the greatest gain for the largest proportion of students. So we thank everyone for registering and for being here during these precious last few days before students come back to school. And if today is the first or second day back for students in your district, then you deserve like a medal for dedication to professional development. A few quick housekeeping notes. The recording of this presentation is going to be available for everyone who registered and will be emailed out shortly after the presentation ends. We've opened the chat function and the Q&A function. Dr. Snyderich has reserved about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. So please use that Q&A feature if you'd like to ask her a question. We'll also be monitoring the chat as well. And, we love posting resources throughout the presentation based on the conversation that's happening. So please don't be shy. Make sure to follow the Reading League Florida on Facebook to keep up to date with our monthly sessions. We are really excited about the lineup of presenters in the next few months. You can also visit us at fl.thereadingleague.org. For our calendar of events and our other resources. We invite everyone to also consider a membership with the Reading League Florida as well. It helps us keep the lights on and to keep bringing you this high quality content like this. So today's session is titled Being Intentional, Selecting Efficient and Effective Instructional Practices that Align with Student Needs. And our presenter is Dr. Stephanie Snyderich. Dr. Snyderich works on the literacy and academics team at the Lastinger Center at the University of Florida, where she researches the effects of reading instructional strategies and designs professional development learning experiences for teachers. She also has a long history as an educator, having taught general education and special education in some capacity for the majority of her career in both face-to-face and online settings. Dr. Snyderich personally has been on the team that is working with the district that I work for. And, I can say confidently that the professional development experiences that her organization delivers is high quality and fully supported by the collective body of scientific evidence known as the science of reading, and has been very beneficial already for teachers and for students. And so without further delay, I give you Dr. Snyderich. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jesse, for that really nice welcome. And welcome to all of you. It's so cool to see people from all over the world. It's really exciting. So we're going to start out with some objectives. Today, what I'm going to do is we are going to address the idea of efficient, effective practices. Rather than a collection of interventions, what we're going to be talking about is the type of instruction you probably already give your students in your classrooms, but how to really target that instruction to the right kids at the right time. And in order to do that, we're going to talk about reading development, the different skills that students need to develop in order to be proficient readers. We'll talk about the instructional hierarchy and strategies, instructional strategies that are associated with that hierarchy. We'll talk a little bit about ways that data exposes what students need and how to use data. I know we collect a lot of data, but let's talk about the way to make it super useful to us in our classrooms. And then hopefully goal would be that you would take away one or more ideas for making your instruction more effective and or efficient. So let's start out with this idea of reading development. I'm going to ask a question, it's probably a really obvious one, but why do we read, everybody? What's the purpose? You can go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm sure you know. The reason is that we read to comprehend. Everything about reading needs to lead to this result. And so all of our reading instruction is meant to build student skills so they can ultimately do this piece of it. Yeah, to understand information, understand our culture, exactly. We're reading to learn, we're reading to understand. However, reading is an extremely complex task. And there are a variety of sub-skills and processes, and they all need to occur simultaneously in order for fluent reading to happen. Now, in the next group of slides, I'm going to walk us through the skills that are necessary to have in place before fluent reading can occur and the way that those skills develop. So we'll talk about that. All right, now just to be clear about how all of this relates to what you do in your classrooms, effective and efficient instruction targets the right skills at the right time and in the right way. But that's not always as easy as it sounds. I mean, I think you'd probably all agree with that statement, but when I first started teaching reading, I was kind of in the ballpark with my instruction. For instance, I knew that I had to teach some phonological awareness, decoding, vocabulary, comprehension, all of that. So I selected activities that kind of fell into those categories or followed the curriculum, actually. But to tell you the truth, I wasn't always as systematic as I should have been. Sometimes my approach was a little scattershot. So maybe not data-driven enough, maybe not targeted closely enough to my students' needs. And over time, I realized that this was kind of a bad thing. The kids that I was teaching were already behind. So at the time, I was a special education teacher. So every wasted instructional minute was a real loss for them. Sometimes my students were learning in spite of me, not because of me. And I really felt like I needed to do better. And that's when I started working on my PhD, actually. I learned that to plan effective instruction that would help my students become strong readers, I really needed to identify which skills they had already mastered, which skills they were learning, and which skills they still needed to learn. And then I needed to actually teach those skills. Oh, sorry. So there's a chat in there about what's pinned. But anyways, so that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll start with a little bit of a big picture. This visual depicts the conceptual framework of reading that we use at the Lastinger Center. And you can see that the comprehension is central with language, fluency, cognitive strategies, and knowledge, all making contributions to reading comprehension. The framework it might look a little complex, but it's a helpful way for us to think about all of the things that are necessary for being a skilled reader. Now, there's some additional models that I like to think about that I think will help us understand how reading skill develops. First, there's this one called Adams Model for processors, and it explains how proficient readers process text, so kind of what else is going on in their brain. Second, there's Aries phases of word recognition and reading development, and this helps us understand how that skill develops. And then third, there's the simple view of reading, which I don't have a slide for actually, but it explains how decoding and written language kind of work together in a multiplicative way in order to facilitate reading comprehension. So we're going to briefly unpack these. We'll start with the Adams model. It helps explain how we take in and process printed text, such as a word wind. So you can see down at the bottom, the word wind is at the bottom. And this is how text enters our brain. We look at it, we see the word. And the orthographic processor over on the left It's not on the left in your brain. It's just on the left in the model. It analyzes the letter sounds and the patterns that we see. And then our phonological processor on the other side, it interacts with the orthographic processor. And we kind of check the pronunciation of the word, and simultaneously our brain is processing the meaning of wind. So we're reading wind, we're thinking about, does that sound right? Did we say it right? And then we think about what we know about wind and how it fits into the context of where the word is actually being read. And all of these processes occur simultaneously, and really importantly for the skill of learning to read, they stem from the information that enters our brain through text, through letters on a page. Now, the Adams model of the 4 processors helps us explain how we take in and process printed text, such as the word wind. Okay, remember, reading is about processing that printed text. So kind of a key takeaway here. Reading there might be other things involved, like motivation and all of that, but essentially the skill of reading, the task of reading is about processing the text that you see. All right, let's move on to Aries' phases of word recognition and reading development, which helps us understand the continuum of how word recognition develops over time. And there are 5 phases. We'll go through them one by one. The first is pre-alphabetic. So remember that seeing words in print is what starts that complex cycle of processing written text happening. So that's what triggers it. What we want to do is move kids through all of the learning phases to the point where everything that needs to happen to read is happening automatically. So if you're working with children in pre-K or kindergarten, or even older kids who are really struggling, they may be at this pre-alphabetic phase. Here, kids use visual cues to process text. They are not yet reading. So here's kind of an example. When they see text at this phase, they might use the picture. So in this case, a child might be at McDonald's with their mom or their grandma, and they might look at the French fry box where it says McDonald's, and they'll say, "This says McDonald's." So it kind of looks like they're reading, and some parents even think that their child is. But what has really happened is they've recognized the icon, the McDonald's logo, and used it to guess the words on the box. So that's what happens in the pre-alphabetic phase. The next phase is the partial alphabetic, and this is where kids are using partial letter sound information. But importantly, their letter sound knowledge and fluency is not complete, so they can't yet blend all the way across a word to get to the correct pronunciation, but they can use letters a little bit. So here's an example. In this phase, the child knows a few letters, and here is a picture of a dog. There's a sentence that says the dog is white, and the child may look at the picture. If they know the letter W and its sound, well, they might correctly guess that the sentence says the dog is white, using that knowledge along with the picture cue. The next phase is called the full alphabetic phase, and this is where students are using all of the letter sounds to decode words. This is a really exciting phase because this is where kids can really put those decoding skills to work. And here's an example. A student sees the word green, and they might sound it out by saying each sound and then blending them all together. So green. After that comes the consolidated alphabetic phase, and this is where decoding is a lot more developed. The student is more efficient. They begin to know chunks of words and patterns that can help them decode longer words or words that are more complex, where there are multi-letter chunks such as phonograms. So as an example of that, a student who knows there are controlled vowels, or the EIGH pattern or the OUS pattern, could read these 2 words, rigorous or neighbor. And usually along with that consolidated alphabetic phase, kids have learned how to break up those longer words into the chunks, and then they sort of decode each individual chunk when they encounter an unknown word. And then the final phase is the automatic phase. Here, reading is really smooth, easy, fluent, it's prosodic. Kids are reading with expression, and they've developed a variety of strategies and skills so they can read whatever comes their way. All right. a key takeaway from all of this is that kids need all of these skills. So I showed you that there's these 5 phases that kids go through, and they really need to have the skills in the phase that comes before, for the most part, in order to get to the next phase. So as you can imagine, like a child who hasn't developed their letter sound fluency, if it's really laborious for them to identify letter sounds, it's going to be harder for them to decode. So it's really essential that kids get all of these building blocks of reading. And this speaks to the initial takeaway that I said. If we want to be efficient and effective with our instruction, we're going to target the right skills at the right time and in the right way. And we'll continue to talk about this as we look at these models, talk about how reading develops. I pulled in this model because I think it's pretty interesting to look at. We can see how Aries phases of word recognition develop in relation to spoken and written language. So we've essentially been talking mostly about, letter sounds and decoding skills and how those kind of bring to bear into reading fluency. But it's important to understand how spoken language goes together with this. So we'll talk through these phases and discuss kind of what kids are learning in spoken language. You can see that the 2 things, spoken and written language, so what they know oral language wise and then what they can do reading wise, are kind of developing and eventually merge. During the pre-alphabetic phase and moving into the partial alphabetic phase, kids are learning about spoken language. This is the part that's supernatural for them. In fact, we don't really teach kids to speak. They kind of pick it up. It's a natural thing for most children to learn how to speak. It isn't, however, natural to learn how to read. So this is where our explicit, intentional instruction is super important. So for instance, students are learning that there are multiple words in sentences. There are multiple words in compound words like playground or freeway. And simultaneously, they're also learning concepts of print. So they're seeing books around, hopefully, and they're learning that the direction of the text on the page matters, and they might be differentiating between pictures and text. Then in the partial alphabetic phase, students are beginning to drill down. They learn more about words. They learn that words have syllables, onsets, and rhymes. And at the same time, they're developing their letter recognition, the names of letters, their shapes, the sounds they make, and that sounds in words can be represented by letters. Now, some kids pick those things up sort of implicitly, like all they need to do is kind of be exposed to those things, and it just sort of magically happens for them. I remember that happening to me as a child. I wasn't really explicitly taught. Reading was very easy to me, but lots of kids, it doesn't click for them. And so they can just kind of go through kindergarten or first grade and kind of miss those basics. And often we have to go back and fill in that information and explicitly teach them these things. As soon as students have developed their phoneme level awareness and have command of a number of letters, just a few, it doesn't have to be tons, they can start to learn to decode. But at that point, it's where that written and spoken language, the text, reading, and what kids can say and the letters they know and everything and the sounds that they understand all begin to merge together. And students begin to do letter by letter decoding. All right, so remember, as these skills develop, research has shown us that one skill helps to strengthen another skill. I want to show you something in a moment, how this idea of awareness of words and word parts can develop separately from phonemes. All right, students with strong phonemic awareness skills and strong letter sound skills. And by strong, we mean they know all the letter sounds and they can say them fairly fluently as soon as they see them. They can get to the point of the full alphabetic phase, where they have the skills they need to blend simple regular words. So for instance, CVC words such as bat or mug, and even CVC words like blot, or CVCC words like sand. And then very quickly, students will need to learn phonograms because they're getting older the text is getting more complex, words are getting longer. And so they need to learn word families, like bug, rug, hug, as well as multi-letter patterns that are more complex. They're ing, igh, EIGH, etc. Basically the chunks that make up longer words. And this will help them move into that consolidated alphabetic phase where everything's sort of coming together for them as a reader. And then once students have developed all of these skills and can do them with automaticity, they move into the automatic phase. And this is where reading is smooth and fluent and prosodic, as we talked about earlier. And for me, you could probably hear my excitement about reading, but for me, it's almost magical. I love to read. It's exciting to read. It's another world to be able to read and to learn things you're interested in. And we want to bring that joy to all kids. So let's review those key skills that we're really talking about here. There's concepts of print. Kids need to understand how books work. There's phonological sensitivity, which is just kind of understanding that there are sounds in words. They need to learn their letter sound knowledge. So they need to learn the letters and the sounds. And they need to develop what's called phoneme level awareness. So being able to hear each sound in a word. And that helps to facilitate early, letter by letter decoding once they have letter sound fluency. Then they move into advanced decoding using larger word chunks, more complex words, and then eventually they gain fluent reading skill. So you can probably see that there's a progression of sorts with vocabulary developing along the way, along with comprehension skills through our read alouds, and later as kids develop their reading skills, they're using those comprehension skills in the context of their own reading. I made all of these skills that are really critical to actually the task of reading green for us. This is kind of interesting. A phonological sensitivity skill like rhyming might not be fully developed, but a student could still acquire phoneme level skills that are necessary for learning to read. This is a piece of research that's kind of interesting. They found that phoneme level awareness develops independently from phonological sensitivity. So some of those skills that we do in kindergarten, around rhyming and clapping to syllables and things, those aren't necessarily directly related to the skill of reading. They enhance it, but what's most important for kids is to really develop that phoneme level awareness and be able to hear a sound and then associate its letter or whatever group of letters that makes that sound, like SH for the digraph, sh. They need to learn how those two things go together. What that research tells us is that phonological awareness instruction related to learning to read should focus on developing phoneme level awareness and letter sound fluency. And that facilitates kids to learn to blend and segment words. Okay, so once they can blend and segment individual phonemes, they'll have the skills they need to decode and actually encode words. Now, in terms of when students typically learn these skills, I included this bar up at the top because phonological sensitivity is usually done in pre-K. That's not to say that older students don't have it very developed, or students with disabilities may not, but generally in pre-K, most kids learn that stuff to a decent enough degree. And then when they get into kindergarten is where they start learning the onset and the rhyme, and learn that individual words have individual sounds for each phoneme and that those are associated with letters. So they're learning their letter names, sounds, the shapes of the letters. And then in K1, we know that typically kids are starting to decode, and some kids are even moving into more advanced decoding. And then by grade 2, we're hoping that they're kind of on their way, and what we're doing is building a lot of knowledge around different letter patterns and comprehension strategies and so forth. right? Now, meanwhile, as I said before, if kids don't have some of those key skills necessary for learning to read, we have to go back and build those skills. It doesn't really matter what the student's age. So even though I mapped out, the grades when that stuff normally happens or typically happens, it's really instruction in these areas is for anyone who needs it. So one question to ask yourself is, do middle school students sometimes need decoding skills? The answer is yes. Can a fifth grader ever need to develop phoneme level awareness? Yes. Do middle school students sometimes, forget letter sounds? That happens sometimes. It just depends on the type of instruction the student has and what kind of background they have in literacy. It's pretty easy to fill that stuff in most of the time. But key idea is that if a child is missing a foundational skill that's blocking them from advancing in their reading, we need to teach that skill, not just teach the grade level stuff harder. For instance, like if you've got a student who's having trouble comprehending, one of the things you should rule out is if there are earlier skills that would contribute to their reading fluency that's really blocking their way. All right. Moving on. So how do we know what skills students need, which would inform what we will need to teach? And the answer to that is assessment data. Assessment data helps us to know. And I know we all know this. We talk a lot about using data to inform instruction, but I think it has been my experience, and I've been in schools and I've been a teacher for a really long time, that sometimes there's copious assessments and they're not always used. Sometimes people just put something on a spreadsheet and never look at it, but hopefully today we can review some data that you might really start to value. So this is a diagnostic model that we use at the Lastinger Center, and it can help you weed through the skills and phases of reading development that we've just discussed and correspond them to assessments that can help us do the database decision-making that can help us target our instruction to exactly what kiddos need. You can see that the assessments chosen and the flowchart are designed to rule out that a skill gap in one of these areas is the underlying reason that a student might be struggling in reading. So let's walk through a few examples. Over on the left, I'll just orient you to this diagram, are a couple of different gray arrows, and they represent an entry point for assessment. So if, let's say you are a first grade teacher, you're probably going to start with some kind of a decoding assessment because that's kind of what kids are learning right then. So let's make sure that they have that skill. And if they don't reach benchmark, if they obviously are missing those skills, you can see that the diagram points downwards and directs you to think about, well, do they at least know how to decode CVC words? Can they say all the sounds in words and blend them together? Because if not, then you need to work on phonemic awareness, phoneme segmenting and blending with that child. But if they know how to blend CVC words, you can go ahead and review your decoding assessment results and decide where to start their instruction in the area of decoding. Now, if that first grader is really fine with decoding, then you might give them a fluency probe and see whether or not they're on grade level for oral reading fluency. And if not, you can work on fluency with that child. That's where you should privilege your instruction. So let's do another example. Let's start with an older child. So someone in, let's say, 4th grade. We're going to start that assessment by giving an oral reading fluency probe, because that's kind of what kids are focusing on at that point in time. They're reading, hopefully for meaning at this point, more or less. So we want to see if they can do that with fluency. And if they are below benchmark on their oral reading fluency, we need to rule out if decoding is the issue, or even if decoding is a problem, we want to also rule out that phonemic awareness isn't the reason that decoding and fluency are at issue. Does this kind of make sense? Then for older children, we're going to start with comprehension. We're going to see if there's any problem with comprehension. And if so, then we're going to go down this diagnostic model and check until we locate that skill area where the student seems to be faltering. And that is where we're going to build our instruction around. Are there any questions about this? Yeah, root cause analysis. Exactly. Thanks, Jordan. I think that was your name, right? Yeah, thank you. All right, so fine, assessment then. But which assessments do we need to do? So we know the areas. It's going to be comprehension assessment, oral reading fluency, something in decoding, something in phonemic awareness. But what would those look like? So we can take a look. We're going to look into some formal or informal assessments. Let me show you some examples here. Often people start with screening. So the beginning of the year is upon us. Screening is a great way to start because it will tell you whether your student is on grade level on a particular skill that is the right type of skill to screen for at their grade level. So for instance, oral reading fluency is a screening assessment for a second grade student in the fall. And that's perfect. It's gonna tell us not only if the student is on grade level for oral reading fluency, and which is the starting point for a second grader back on that diagnostic model that I showed you, but you're also going to have the opportunity to see a little bit of their reading. You know, when they do an oral reading fluency probe, students are reading and they make mistakes sometimes they skip lines. You'll know how fast they are, so you'll know their level of automaticity. All of these things are really useful pieces of information for you to determine where someone should get their instruction or start their instruction at. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about this? Some assessments also fall more into the diagnostic category. The Core Phonics survey is an example of that. It gives you a lot of kind of molecular information about the types of words your student can decode, but it also has a benchmark, and so it can be a little bit of a screener. You can see whether or not a student is on level for their decoding skills. I love the Core Phonics survey because it just shows you whether or not students can decode CVC words or are controlled, whether they know their digraphs, whether they know their letter blends, that kind of things. Okay, so let's briefly review the assessments, specific ones that I would use with the diagnostic model. So for phonemic awareness, I would for sure do a phoneme segmentation assessment, and that could be a screener. And for those types of assessments, generally what students will do is segment 3 and 4 phoneme words. So an example would be that the instructor says sat, and the student is supposed to say all the sounds in the word sat. So sat. And then the Core Phonics survey, which we just talked about a moment ago, that begins with easier decoding skills, like alphabet skills and letter sounds. And then it moves to more, down a continuum of decoding skills, CVC, consonant blends, and so forth. You can see this list. You can use the alphabet skills and letter sounds portion of the Core Phonics survey to begin ruling out what kids do and don't need in the way of decoding. An important distinction here with the Core Phonics survey is that what you learn about letter sounds is not a fluency measure. So the teacher just says to the student, look at these letters, can you tell me the sound each letter makes? So that helps you know whether or not kids know all the letters and know the sounds. But there are letter sound fluency probes out there where a student is supposed to say as many sounds of the letters as they can in 1 minute. And some of the probes even have the first 26 letters randomly positioned on the page. And so you can have the child say all the letter sounds for a minute, make a mark after the timer goes off, and let them continue until they've completed the first 26. And you can use that probe as for 2 reasons. You can see exactly what letters the student knows, and you can also have that fluency rate, so you can tell whether or not actually increasing fluency of letter sound knowledge is something that you need to target for your instruction. So the screener itself is really valuable. Just a quick question for the group. Why do we care about letter sound fluency? Isn't it enough to just know the letter sounds? This is a conversation I've had with lots of teachers over the years. It has to be automatic. You've probably heard about a concept called cognitive load. And so reading is one of those things where you want to lessen the cognitive load wherever you can, so that the student has as much of their brain available to comprehend what they're reading. So things like letter sounds, if they're fluent, things like decoding, if it's fluent and the student can do it rapidly, it really enhances their ability to comprehend. It just leaves brain space for that, if it makes sense. There's a question in the chat that I want to talk about at the end. If we can just remember, someone was asking whether or not you would screen at a lower grade level for some kids. If they're reading at a lower grade level, we can talk about that at the end.
I'll make sure to make a note of that.
Thanks. So just what I said, letter sound fluency means less cognitive load when producing letter sounds during decoding. And that is an important thing for kiddos to have mastery over. Just makes everything a lot easier. This is a scored portion of the core phonics survey, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. So here's the CVC words part. And you can see that there are some real words in the first 2 rows. And then there's some non-words. And I want to talk about that for a second. So in the core phonics survey, they're both in the same section, but there's actually something called a nonsense word fluency probe, if you may be familiar with, where all of the words are non-words or nonsense words. Depends. Sometimes they'll call them nonsense. Sometimes they'll call them non-words. Sometimes they're made up words, but regardless, I think an important cultural piece is that the words that end up showing up on these probes are sometimes actually real words in other languages. So that's important to know if you have a classroom with kids from different places. So there might be, Native American words that are spelled this way, or Hmong words, something like that. So just be sensitive about that, because nonsense might sound a little pejorative, but that doesn't make the measure non-helpful. It's actually a really great measure. The way it's designed with those non-words means that kids don't already know these words. And so it's a nice, pure measure of decoding. And the nonsense word fluency probe is also great because the instructions have students choose between saying each letter sound in the word or reading the whole word, or they can actually do both. And so that probe helps give you information about letter sounds that kids know too. So I find it really helpful for both letter sound fluency information as well as information about decoding. Some people ask why nonsense words and actually object to them because it's not authentic reading. And my answer to that is that, again, nonsense words help us understand the skills of an early decoder because they don't know any of the words from memory. And to the people that might say, oh, it's not really an authentic reading task, You're sort of right, unless you're reading, Dr. Seuss or something, which also has a lot of sort of nonsense words in it. But don't worry, it's just 1 minute. It's not a really long probe. So you're not giving your student lots and lots of experience in nonsense words. And sometimes they even have kind of fun doing it. Here's more from the core phonics survey. This is what the consonant blends with short vowels student page looks like. There is a section on multisyllabic words. This is super helpful for those older students. You can figure out whether or not they can do simpler decoding and they're competent with that, but maybe this is where they falter. And then there are oral reading fluency probes, and this is the fluency measure that you would use with the diagnostic model, where it said fluency or oral reading fluency. And an oral reading fluency probe is a passage at grade level that a child does a cold read on. That means that they haven't practiced it previously, and they just read for 1 minute. And while they're reading, you're marking a passage with any of the errors, and you can mark when they skip lines and so forth, and you can actually pay even more attention than the instructions say to the types of reading behaviors that students use. Like, are they looking down the whole time? Do they track? That sort of thing. An important idea about these measures is you can't screen using just any old passage. So you can't just open up a grade level book from your classroom library and use it for this purpose. And that is because these passage sets are created to be approximately equally difficult. And they are psychometrically tested to be that way. So they're valid and reliable. And it means that no matter which of the passages you give to a student, they're basically the same level of difficulty every time you give them. Meanwhile, if you just take a book out of your classroom library, it may be one passage, even at the same grade level. So let's say you're looking at a EIL level 16 or something. 2 pages from 2 EIL 16 books may be very, very different in terms of difficulty. And that would mean that you're not getting good data, not for screening. It's fine for instruction. It's just not a good screening measure. And we can talk about that at the end if you guys are interested. That's something that's really important, though. Use psychometrically validated oral reading fluency probes. Don't make them up. And then in order to screen for comprehension, you can use a simple core reading maze comprehension probe, which is a 3-minute reading. Student reads a passage, and you can see that some of the sentences have an empty spot with 3 word choices, and they select and circle which word fits in to the sentence the best. So it helps us to predict whether or not students have an issue with comprehension. So it's just a good screener. It's not a comprehensive measure of comprehension. It doesn't measure vocabulary directly or anything like that. But it does give you a hint as to whether or not this is an area to target for instruction for students. And I wanted to show you that these, and I see that Jesse has been putting some of these things into the chat, but these materials are free online. You can get the Core Phonics survey for free. There's the Dibbles 8th with all of those different types of assessments I talked about. And then there's a core reading maze, but Dibbles also has a maze passage set also. So even if your school district isn't currently using these kinds of assessments, you can. They're not very long, but they're super helpful. All right, the key takeaway of this section is that you need assessments to help you understand what skills your students have mastered, the skills they are learning, and the skills they still need to learn so you can target the right skills in your instruction. Now, we've established that it's important for kids to learn the skills that are necessary for fluent reading. And we also know that we need to target those skills at the right time, and that assessments can help us do that. But what really do we mean by providing instruction in the right way? So to answer that question, it's important to understand something called the instructional hierarchy. And this topic is near and dear to my heart. To help you internalize the importance of the concepts that I'm going to talk about next, I want you to start by thinking about a skill you don't have. So something that, it might even be a skill you want to learn and or you've tried it and you've just totally bombed, but put it in the chat. It's kind of fun to see what people come up with. And then I'll tell you a story. A skill you don't have. Golfing. All right. Liz, brave, sewing, playing the piano, stained glass making. Excellent. Chin ups. Same, Monica. I am with you on that. All right. So what does it feel like to be just learning something like this? Think about like if you were to have to just do this right now, like grab the bar and do some chin-ups, or someone threw you a needle and thread or a sewing machine and said, start sewing a t-shirt or whatever. How would it feel to you to do something that you don't really know how to do? Overwhelming, intimidating. We might be anxious, nervous, hesitant. We might be scared even. Yeah. Excellent. Oh yeah, we sometimes are motivated too, as an adult, especially if you have that kind of mindset that you believe you can learn things. But sometimes our kids come to us where they've had experienced a lot of failure, or even people have told them they're a failure. And so it's important to understand what it feels like and to think about what it feels like to learn a brand new skill. So sometimes when I do a presentation about the instructional hierarchy, I actually have this dance instruction video to Pharrell's song Happy, and everybody has to get up and dance and follow the directions and everything. And so we have a very real interaction with what it is like to do something you don't presently know how to do. So I won't ask you to do that right now, but I can tell you that what you've said is true. It's hard to learn a new skill. You feel a little scared. So what kind of supports are helpful to you at that stage when you're first learning? Step-by-step instruction. Yeah. Patience, modeling. Excellent. You guys are so smart. All right. So now think about a skill you need to practice more. So you actually know how to do it. You don't have to put it in the chat, but think about a skill that you know how to do, but you're not fluent at it yet. What do you have to do to get fluent? So earlier, for instance, someone said they want to learn how to play the piano. Is there anybody in there like me who can play the piano, but I'm pretty rusty right now? What will I need in order to get better? Practice at appropriate level, some time. Yeah, time is super important. Okay. And then now think about your skill where you're good at this. Oh, Catherine, I want to acknowledge what you're saying, that everyone's time will be different. Correct. That's so important. And it's hard in schools because we are kind of all moving at the same rate during the day. Reading's done when it's done. But yeah, kids are moving at different rates in terms of their learning. Yep, you're relaxed and confident. With the music video, instruction video that I show, the analogy that I draw is that when somebody can do that dance, that's when you start to kind of like, you do more, you add on, you might be able to just like do it with more style and finesse. And you might even actually be able to do it in different locations. Like I could do it in the yard, or I could do it in my living room, or I could even do it on stage in front of people, or I could do it in a confined space even. Because it's easy enough for me to do it, and I can do it in different locales. So what we've been talking about is actually the stages of the instructional hierarchy that I want to target today. They are acquisition, which this is when you're slow at the skill, but you're hopefully increasing in accuracy. You're learning to do it without a lot of mistakes. But then you move into the automaticity stage where you should be accurate, but you need to increase your fluency. And then finally, the generalization stage, which is something we don't talk about very much in schools, but this is when we can do something with automaticity, but now we are going to learn to do it in a variety of places and for different purposes and things. So this is how it maps onto what you did. Acquisition is that skill you don't have yet, or that you're just learning. Automaticity is the skill you still need to practice, but you do know. And then the generalization is, I'm really pretty good at this, but I can improve or be able to do it more flexibly. And I like how people are talking about enjoyment and things like that too, because that's really when you get to that generalization stage or beyond, you really do, it's easy. So it can be fun, All right, so as you're considering what helps you when you're at a particular instructional hierarchy stage, you'll probably understand that matching instruction to our students' instructional stage will also help make our instruction more effective and efficient and really support them. So let's go over how each of these stages show up in your students' reading behavior and how you can know where they are at with their learning and the type of support that would make your instruction more effective and efficient and promote the most learning. So you want to match them together. At the acquisition stage, this is what you might see. You might see some of the things that you guys put in the chat. So there's confusion. You might do the skill slowly. You might make some mistakes. This is what it looks like. And as a teacher, it's exactly what you guys said in the chat. You should model, provide examples. In reading, we're going to think aloud, so that we can model metacognition. You'd get corrective feedback, provide specific praise, and practice, but it's unspeeded. So you're not going to push kids to go fast. You're just going to have them do it lots of times so that they acquire the skill, so they learn how to do it. That's an important distinction. The goal is to promote being able to do the skill with high accuracy, with little to no support from you. And keeping in mind that 95% correct on whatever is about the independent level that you'd be striving for. At the automaticity stage, the student does the skill accurately, but probably slowly at first, increasing with automaticity with practice that you are providing. So you should provide lots of practice. Make sure it's observable so you can monitor. Think about ways to make it observable if you can't be there. In my special education classroom, I would have kids, if I was having them record their independent reading, because they were just practicing to develop their automaticity, I actually had them record it on a little recorder so I could listen to it later if I wanted to. It actually just kind of kept them on task better for them to believe that I was going to be listening to them reading later. And it was also a great way to send home snippets of their reading to their parents in an email, which was also kind of groovy. You want to provide some speeded practice. So you're actually explicitly helping the child understand that they're going to try to improve their rate. And you'll always provide feedback and specific praise, but including on their rate and accuracy, because that is a focus of this type of instruction at the automaticity stage. The goal is for the child to meet, normative benchmarks for fluency, and whether the skill's oral reading fluency or just fluency in letter sounds, or fluency in nonsense words, or fluency in phoneme segmenting. All of those skills need to be not only acquired, but also automatic. And so we want to take assessment so that we can tell if kids have acquired a level of automaticity in those things. We want them to retain the skill over time. So it's there if the child goes home for a vacation and comes back and still knows it. And if they don't, you might have to brush them back up on the skill. And at this phase 2, you'll see students begin to combine skills with other skills. And that's why a student who's becoming more automatic in their reading might use a decode one, what they know about decoding one type of word to help them decode a new type of word they haven't learned before, but that relates somehow. So sort of some analogic thinking. And then finally, generalization. Again, this is where we often do not seem to have time, or people don't take the time to focus. But this is where the student does the skill with automaticity, and with prompting will do it in novel contexts. So the pictures on this screen, you can see that the girl on the right, she's reading a menu. The girl on the left, she's reading off of an iPad, so not even a book. She's reading a recipe. That's generalization. It's taking the reading task and it's moving it to other spaces. You should provide opportunities for the student to do the skill, whatever it is, in different contexts, and actually praise them for generalizing. And again, this is something we don't always teach. We teach maybe to automaticity, or maybe we teach to acquisition, but we don't get all the way to this point where you have all confirmed for me that this is the spot we want to be. We want to be confident. We want it to be easy. We want to feel good about it and for it to be enjoyable for us, but we really can't unless we get it to this generalization phase, and even the phase beyond, which is adaptation, when you can manipulate the skill and use it in creative new ways. But you'll want to monitor automaticity and accuracy at this point, because you don't want the student to kind of slide back and become careless or make lots of mistakes as they're trying to go faster or using that skill in different situations. Your goal is for the student to do the skill in novel contexts with no prompting from you. So if you teach them a comprehension strategy, or you teach them how to monitor their reading for accuracy, you want to see them do that strategy when you're not over their shoulder. And you want them to continue to be accurate and fluent as they engage in doing that skill. So some of you might be wondering then, if we know we have to teach students the right skills at the right time and in the right way, match our instruction to the instructional hierarchy stage, how do we know what stage the kid is at? Well, the last slides, I gave you some cues as to what it might look like, but we can talk a little bit further. It's basically data again, folks. It's data. Data helps us know the skills our students have mastered, the ones they're learning, and the ones they still need to develop. And it can help us know what instructional hierarchy stages students are into. We can use the information to fine-tune our instruction. And again, I'm kind of harping on this point, but it makes our instruction most efficient and effective for students, which I can't say enough is critical, because we're usually teaching kids who are farther behind their peers. And so we need to maximize our moments in the classroom. All right. So we've already talked about more formal assessments, the CBMs and stuff. But honestly, you can tell about a student's instructional hierarchy stage in many cases just by digging into their screening diagnostic data or watching them. Okay. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Any measure of fluency will help you know if a student is in the acquisition stage. So I can just take an oral reading fluency measure, and if they're not fluent, I know that they are still learning to become fluent. So that's a quickie. I guess provided they don't have a decoding need, if they're below grade level in oral reading fluency, that I need to work on their automaticity. Let's think about what we can learn from watching students in our classroom, though, because it's much more important that you monitor your students' learning and adjust your instruction accordingly on a day-to-day basis. And you're not going to be taking formal or screening assessments every single day, not even progress monitoring. Those only happen once a week. So in between those assessment points, you need to have some ways to figure out where your kids are at so you can adjust your instruction in the moment. And one of the things I used to think about for myself, I actually taught EBD, or, emotional behavioral disorders, kids with autism. I had kids with learning disabilities. And I found that in order for me to be the best teacher, all of these strategies that I'm talking about, they kind of, including the behavioral ones, because that's what I was also working with, they had to be in my hip pocket, is what I used to say. It's not enough to understand what I'm saying, which I'm sure you all do because you're bright people. You've probably heard it in training before. It is essential that you know these options well enough, and you know how to read the data well enough that you can use it in an intuitive way on a day-to-day basis. And that's a different type of learning than just understanding. That requires practice on your part and intentional kind of systematic use of these tools and these frameworks. All right. So for this purpose, you might be relying on informal measures, such as your weekly progress monitoring probes, but more likely just your own observations of students during your instruction. So let's take a look at a few scenarios to give you an idea of what that could be. So here's where I'm going to want you to weigh in the chat. So this sample scenario, we have a student, they're decoding CVC words using manipulative letters. These are the types of words that they're being given to decode. Their teacher's having them move around letters on a cookie sheet. And what the teacher observes is that the student is accurate and fluent because every word that she gives the student, they're pretty much getting it right, over 95% accuracy during instruction. So what instructional hierarchy stage does this represent? We have the choice between acquisition, automaticity, or generalization. All right, let's see if you guys are right. So here's the key. They're already fluent. So it's generalization because they're already fluent. If they were developing fluency and it wasn't quite where you wanted it to be, so maybe if it was more like 85% fluent or like not as quick, then you would practice fluency. But if they already are fluent, now you're going to work on generalization. So what would the instruction look like? CVC decoding, what is generalization of that? They've been doing words and lists. So what's an example of generalizing that? So just to remind you, it's using the skill in a different context. Decodable text, words and sentences, connected text. Very good. Very good. One of the things that I will say, Tony, I noticed that you said sorting, and I want to say something about sorting. Be careful with sorting because it's good for recognition of pattern, but it doesn't help kids practice patterns. And the reason I know this is from years of doing like words their way interventions. If kids don't follow the right protocol with words their way interventions, you risk just having them visually sort. So for instance, if you had SH and CH digraphs and you just had them arrange them on a page in rows. So here's the SH digraph ones, here's the CH ones. They can just arrange them by whether they have SH or CH, which is just visual discrimination. And unless the child is actually reading every single word out loud, it doesn't enhance their decoding. So it does enhance their visual discrimination, and it can enhance, it can help with encoding, but that's a different skill than what we're talking about here. This is a decoding skill. So that's an important distinction that for me, it took me a while to really say, oh, I get it. I'm not having them actually decode because I don't really know. I guess we don't know if they're reading in their minds. They might be, but some kids don't. I have watched some kids not and just sort them by visual. And then other kids who just do exactly what you told them, which is to read each word in the list as they sort, and that's totally fine. So an example of instruction to generalize would be something like practice with leveled text or authentic text or decodable text. That's what I meant to say, actually, decodable text, because we would want, well, actually, no, what am I saying? I probably wouldn't do decodable. And here's the reason why. This student is at the generalization stage. And so what we want to do is push them to be able to read those words in contexts where they don't show up reliably. And in decodable texts, it's a really heavy load of CVC words. There aren't very many other types of words in between. And it's a little bit harder to do it when they're more interspersed. Let's see here. Someone's saying, but I'm visualizing this as more of tier 2. If it were tier 2, then student would be working with grade level text. Oh, I'm not sure if we'll address that later, because I might have you unmute and talk about what you mean. All right, sample scenario 2. So here we've got our controlled vowels. It's another decoding problem. And this time the student is inaccurate but slow, and they're reading a decodable word, our decodable book with our controlled words, but they're less than 90% accuracy during instruction. What phase or what stage are they in? Exactly, it's acquisition. So what kind of instruction could you do to improve their accuracy? Does anyone remember from before? They're inaccurate and slow. But because they're inaccurate, we're not going to try to increase their rate at this point. The first thing is accuracy to build. So you'll want to give them good decoding practice with our controlled vowels. So same stimuli, but we want it to be unspeeded practice. So yeah, and still, Jennifer, in that phase in acquisition, you might still be modeling and providing examples. You might reteach, for their mistake points, that sort of thing. Good job, you guys. And then the last scenario, here we have a student who is self-monitoring. That's the skill we're focusing on, but they don't know. So this is a little tricky. This student does not notice or fix errors while reading independently, but they self-monitor well when observed, but not while reading independently. So this is a little sticky. If they can do it when they're observed, where are they at? Yeah. So we don't need to develop the skill really. What we need to do is encourage the generalization. And this is the part where we sometimes don't do it. Like, student does it fine when they're in front of you, but then how many of you have had a student take the state test and you're like, they know this? I've had it happen a gazillion times where I'm like, oh my gosh, they know how to do this and they're just not generalizing it. Yep. So generalization, provide practice in novel contexts, provide praise for generalization. So here's where you're going to get explicit. You're going to make sure they know that they're supposed to be doing it by themselves on their own when you're not looking. So how I might do it is I might challenge them to do independent self-monitoring during their independent reading. And I might sort of casually monitor and try to catch them doing that and praise them when I see it. You can also have kids self-report that they've done it. That works too. The main idea is you want to bring attention to, you want it to be top of mind that they're supposed to be doing this skill by themselves when it's appropriate. All right, so takeaway, students benefit most from instruction that matches their instructional hierarchy stage for the target skill. So before we get to the question and answer portion, I'm just going to name a couple of really great practices that I like. They're very similar, and by couple, there's hardly any. So I don't have protocols for you, but the protocols are out there. And I'll give you a little bit of extra information about how you can learn a lot more about all of these things at the very end of my presentation. So if you're trying to help students learn to phoneme segment and blend, you can use Alkonen boxes. And this is where you help students hear sounds and words. So you might say, key. What are the sounds we hear in key? And you might say, you might model for the child, k, e. I hear two sounds in key, k, e. And then you teach them to use little chips to put into Alkonen boxes, which are these little boxes you see on the screen. And they push up one chip for k and one chip for e. And to segment, you would just say, what are the sounds in the word key? And the student would have to produce that for you, k, e. Or what are the sounds in cat, k, at. And if you want them to blend, you would give them the sounds and have them tell you the word. So you would say something like, I'm going to give you two sounds, k, e. What word? And they would say key, or k, at, and they would say cat. So it's a really simple strategy. It's very effective for teaching phoneme segmenting and blending. Really easy to do. For improving letter sound fluency, you can just practice letter sounds. And I used to work for Serve Minnesota as their assistant director of innovative programming. And we did tons and tons of these. We had AmeriCorps volunteers who did tons of letter sound fluency interventions, and they just lined up letters, and students, they just pointed under the letters and the students would say the sounds like k, b, l, and then they'd mix up the letters and do it again, and they'd mix up the letters and do it again, and they would change the letters, change out letters as students acquired letters. And it's just practice. That's all. Really simple. You can do it practically anywhere. Magnetic letters, it can be done by drawing them on a whiteboard or a piece of paper, on sticky notes, whatever. Super easy. Decoding practice. Provide instruction using manipulative letters. And for this, you want to have some word lists prepared, and you're going to use monochromatic magnetic letters. So students don't start attending to the color of letters as like extra information about the letters. Like, we don't want them to only think that red letters are vowels. We just have them all the same color. It's best. And then your list is going to change. Notice how I didn't have bed, led, med, red, etc. But I changed different parts of the words in my list. So I've got bed, led, lid, lip, hip, and so on. The reason we don't just change one letter most of the time is because it's just a little more challenging for the student, and they don't just attend to the initial sound or whatever sound you're changing each time. You're just creating a situation where it forces them to be a little bit more flexible thinkers. We can talk more about that at the end, but word list creation is really important. There are some situations where you might want a patterned list like bed, med, red, etc. But we can talk about that at the end. And then my personal favorite for fluency practice is just repeated reading. Super easy, you guys. You can read the same passage, or you can just continually have kids continue on in a passage. Read for a minute and then read for another minute and read for another minute, and you can graph their words correct per minute. It's just practice. And there is scads of studies that show that practice improves skills. It doesn't matter the kind of skill, it just does. It always does. Practice helps. All right, so our key takeaways today are that effective and efficient instruction targets the right skills at the right time in the right way. Assessment data can help you target the right skills, and those assessment data includes what you see kids doing in your classroom. Students begin or develop foundational reading skills in one phase before progressing to the next. So remember, back to phases of word recognition and reading development. It's really hard to decode if you don't know your letters. It's really hard to encode or decode if you have no phonemic awareness. And it's really hard to read fluently, and I would say impossible if you cannot decode fluently. So those skills are essential to become a fluent reader. Letter sound fluency means less cognitive load when producing letter sounds during decoding, and the same is true for decoding skills. Decoding fluency means less cognitive load when reading fluently. You just want to lighten up the load for the brain. That's a key idea. Nonsense words as an assessment can help us understand the skills of an early decoder. And then students benefit most from instruction that matches their instructional hierarchy stage for the target skill. And the better you know all of these things, you can do it in general ed, you can do it for special ed, you can do it on the fly, because it's in your hip pocket. It's part of your sort of DNA as a teacher. And it just makes you more powerful as a teacher. The last thing I want to show to you is that a lot of what I do involves working with the literacy matrix, which is a big project at the University of Florida. It's an approved route to reading endorsement for the University of Florida. And that's where you can learn and go way deeper in all of these topics. So this is what it looks like. These are the elements of the modules, and feel free to reach out to me by email, or you can just Google Lastinger Center or Literacy Matrix and get more information that way, but I'm happy to answer questions. And thank you for your time. I'm on Twitter as Reading Dr. Stephanie, and this is my email address, and it has been a pleasure to talk with you today, and I'm ready for questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Snyderich. I'm not going to put my camera on because I think it puts me front and center in everyone's screen. So I would like you to remain front and center here with your contact information. So we have a couple of questions from the Q&A that had come in. Thank you, everyone, for the really nice conversation in the chat and for throwing those questions in the Q&A. So I'll just kind of take them from the top. The first question is from Jordan, who has a fear with this framework is that the student is in the acquisition phase and that teachers will not give the students grade level content. Any thoughts? And they are thinking particularly about English language learners.
Oh, yes. Okay. So a lot of what I'm talking about here is the specialized instruction that is addressing their need. And that is not what kids do all day long. They do it for part of their day. So think about this as supplemental. So this is in addition to core. And that's always tricky, because is there such a thing as supplemental? The answer is really no, because whatever time you use to do an intervention per se that matches the student's skill need, it takes away from time you could be doing something else or time they could be doing something else, like playing or going to art or whatever. So you do have to kind of look holistically at the child, but keep in mind that at a point it is really inefficient to not give them the level of instruction they need so that they can actually be at grade level or closer to. The further behind they get, the more you need to do to just even help them participate in grade level instruction. So that's kind of an answer that isn't an answer. It is a concern that is difficult to square with what we want for kids, which is for them all to have an equal day, right? But when a child is behind, so many other things are already not equal. For instance, they're looking around the room and they can't read the instructions, or they go on a field trip and they can't read the directions at the science museum on the manipulative activity or whatever. So they're already missing out. So you do have to balance providing that instruction with making sure that they get core instruction that is at their grade level. One of the things that I used to do as a special education teacher is to find material that helped bridge that. So for instance, National Geographic used to make these great National Geoscience publications where they were multi-level, but it was the same information, but it was just presented slightly differently so that the student was getting the grade level content, but at a reading level that they could access. So anyway, I hope that helps a little bit. I know that that is a quandary as a special education teacher. Believe me, I'm with you on it.
Yeah, thank you. I want to go back to a question that came in from the chat earlier about screening at a below grade level for students who exhibit reading difficulties.
Okay, so if they're more than a couple years below grade level, you might consider a lower screener. But remember that when you give students a screener that's on grade level, it always helps you understand how they are performing relative to grade level, so you can understand just what that gap looks like. I think like when it's a 1-minute screener, it's not very long. So it's not overly embarrassing or difficult, and it's just done a couple of times a year. You could progress monitor the student on a weekly basis using a probe that is more at the grade level where they're reading at. But you just always have to remember that the improvement that you see is on a probe set that's not on grade level. And so I guess I would recommend screening at grade level and progress monitoring it on a lower grade level if they're at least 2 years below grade level. That's a recommendation also from Dr. Ted Christ, who I worked with at the University of Minnesota, and he's the one who founded FastBridge and developed all those assessments. So that's information from him, and I tend to agree with him on that. But yeah, just always remember that the information you're getting is not just at some point you're going to want to like up the ante and really like push the student to develop to the next grade level up. But it totally makes sense that you might use a lower grade level probe for progress monitoring, since you're doing that every single week.
Yeah, that's exactly the sort of protocol that we use in the district that I'm a part of. We'll monitor progress on that off grade level, and then on a weekly basis if the student is receiving intensive tier 3 interventions, and then on a grade level on a less frequent basis, perhaps monthly, to see if there's generalization to grade level skills, grade level text. Next question. From Jordan, who says they are aware that Fountas and Pinnell's guided reading sort of assessment, their leveled assessments, is widely inefficient as far as the assessment goes.
Oh,
about
they're so time consuming, you guys. Like so that relates to another question in the text in the chat right now. So those things that are more informal or really extensive, like DRA, that's another example of one of those, very subjective. It does give you information. I'm not gonna lie. Like, you have kids do retelling and there's a whole bunch of pieces of information, but really think about whether or not a 45-minute assessment for each student is better and provides more information than you just being systematically observant of your instruction, and kind of hit pretty close to where you need to be by using your screening assessments and the diagnostic assessments I showed you today. So it's a lot. If you add up all the time it takes you to do those longer assessments, you might find it's not really worth it, and that you can extract some of the same information by watching your students during instruction. So Cynthia, I'll just say, like, good follow-up question. How do you determine what level they are on? You can give them a book. So if they are reading below grade level, just below grade level, or on near grade level, you can just use the reading level that is close to grade level, and you can just let them read for a page and see what happens. And if it's really too hard, go further down a couple levels and try that. And kind of, it's probably faster. That's how I would do it. That's how I have done it. But I also was asked to do DRA and Fountas and Pinnell when I was a teacher. So I get it. And we can be really reliant on those reading levels, but you can find them out different ways too, just by giving students the books to read and see how they do.
And if you all are interested in this type of discussion, we are having on in In October, Dr. Matt Burns, who has an expert in this area. I know Dr. Snyderich has also had some conversations online with Dr. Burns.
He's actually was on my dissertation committee at the University of Minnesota. So he's at Missouri now, but he was there then.
Yes.
So we're friends.
Awesome. Great.
He's awesome.
Yes, we are very much looking forward to his expertise, particularly in the area of IRIs and the uses or lack thereof of leveled reading sorts of assessments.
Yeah, actually, one thing he'll probably tell you when you hear from him, but he has done some analysis on those assessments, and they're actually, he found that they were really no better than chance. And so he would say like their reliability just wasn't better than chance. And so he would often quip in conferences, well, you could flip a coin and it would just take less time, So that's another way to think about it. Having really reliable, validated assessments, it saves you a lot of time.
Yep, you're absolutely right. So one of the power of something like DIBELS or Acadience or EasyCBM is in how well they predict who will go on to struggle with it on an end of year assessment, like an FSA or a SAT 10 or any sort of other end of year assessments. And DIBELS, they are very, very highly predictive of these things. There's been large scale studies that make sure that they have predictive validity versus something like a Fountas and Pinnell where it's a coin flip. Whether they're predictive?
And that is such a good point. And an add-on to that is that they're not perfect. No. So your follow-up data, sometimes people will complain, they'll say, yeah, well, one of my students that wasn't true for, like it wasn't right. It didn't measure one of my students correctly. Don't let, perfect be the enemy of good. Like they aren't perfect. There is no such thing as a perfect assessment. Neither a subjective or an objective assessment tests with perfection every single time, perfect accuracy. There is test error in every test, but what you want to look for is the types of assessments that have the least amount of error so that you're the most likely to be right.
Absolutely. Thank you. That is such useful words, Dr. Snyderich. There were a couple of other questions in the chat about if you'd be willing to make these slides available to the participants in a PDF form.
Absolutely.
Perfect. And so we'll go ahead and make sure that those go out along with the recording of this session. Were there any other questions? There's another Q&A, but I think that person was just sort of clarifying their words in the chat. Does anyone have any other questions for Dr. Snyderich? Okay. So then I think, and so we are at time here. It is 5:30. So Dr. Snyderich, thank you so much for spending some time here with us. Such useful information, such timely information. I know the chat was fantastic. Everyone very much enjoyed it. And again, so you have Dr. Snyderich information here in the slide, and always feel free to reach out to the Reading League Florida. If you're a fan of us on Facebook, we respond very quickly to messages. And yeah, so I hope everyone has a great day and good luck and in your first days with your students.
All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate your engagement and your questions. And feel free to follow up and ask me anything via email. Have a great day.